She had everything. The corner office, the designer dress, the rooftop full of people who believed every carefully crafted word of her biography. What none of them knew, what she had spent years making sure they would never know, was standing in the elevator lobby right now, holding a wrapped birthday gift, wearing a flannel shirt with grease still under his fingernails. Her father had come. And in the next 4 minutes, Victoria Sterling, youngest female CEO in Meridian Financial's history, would do the most unforgivable thing she had ever done. She would pretend she didn't know him, like this video. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of her 30th birthday, Victoria Sterling woke up at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her alarm, the way she always did when something important was happening. She lay flat on her back in the dark of her apartment on the 34th floor of the Callaway Tower, staring at a ceiling she couldn't see, listening to the city hum 14 stories below the clouds. She was 30 today. She said it out loud, just once, to no one. 30. It didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would when she was young. Back then, 30 had seemed like a finish line, proof that all the striving and sacrificing and staying up until 2 in the morning memorizing financial models had meant something. Now that she was here, standing on what most people in her industry would call the summit, she mostly felt tired and alert. The way an animal feels when it's wandered into unfamiliar territory and isn't sure yet whether anything in the shadows is watching. She got up, made coffee the way she always made it, black, no sugar, in the plain white mug she'd had since graduate school, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window looking east, where the sky was doing something beautiful over the harbor. Shades of burnt orange bleeding into deep purple. She watched it for exactly 4 minutes. Then she set down the mug, opened her laptop, and started reading the overnight reports from the Asian markets. This was who Victoria Sterling was at 30, even on her birthday. She had not always been this person. There was an earlier version of her, a girl in Culver's Creek, Ohio, who wore her hair in 2 uneven braids and could identify the make and model of a car engine by sound alone because her father had taught her. A girl who spent Saturday mornings lying on a creeper under a '94 Silverado, handing tools upward on command while Ethan Carter narrated what he was doing and why, patient as a man who genuinely believed that knowledge was the only thing worth giving a child. Hand me the torque wrench, Vic. This one? No, that's the... Yeah, okay, that one works too. Come on now, pay attention. She had loved those mornings. She had loved the smell of the garage, motor oil and metal, and the faint sweetness of the orange-scented hand cleaner Ethan kept in a pump dispenser by the sink. She had loved the way her father explained things, not talking down to her, not simplifying, just explaining, the way you'd explain something to a person you respected. She had loved being that girl. And then gradually, she had stopped being her. It didn't happen all at once. These things never do. It happened the way water carves a canyon, slowly, invisibly, one small erosion at a time. It started when she got the scholarship to Harwick University and moved to the city at 18. It accelerated during her MBA when she noticed that the people around her came from a specific kind of background that she didn't share, and that they had a specific kind of ease she didn't have, and that she was going to have to work twice as hard just to seem like she belonged in the same room. So she worked twice as hard. She learned which fork was for salad and which was for the entree. She learned not to say ain't, not that she'd ever said it much, but she stripped out every trace of anything that might place her outside of what she needed to be. She bought clothes she couldn't afford on a credit card she could barely manage, because she understood that in her industry, presentation was substance. She remade herself so thoroughly, so precisely, that by the time she was 26 and walking into her first executive interview at Meridian Financial, there was almost nothing left of the girl from Culver's Creek. Almost. Ethan was still there. He was always still there, calling on Sunday evenings, leaving voicemails when she didn't pick up, which was often, because she was usually in a meeting or preparing for one or recovering from one, never complaining about it, just saying things like, "Hey kiddo, just checking in. Heard it might rain there this week. Hope you got an umbrella. Love you." And she would listen to the voicemail standing in the middle of her spotless kitchen, and something would tighten in her chest, something she couldn't name, and then she would put the phone face down on the counter and go back to whatever she'd been doing. She sent money. regularly, generously, the kind of wire transfers that would have seemed impossible to either of them when she was growing up. She told herself that was enough, that it was more than enough, that most people didn't even do that much. She told herself a lot of things. The party had been Clara Whitfield's idea. Clara was Victoria's chief of staff and the closest thing she had to a friend inside the company, which is to say she was someone Victoria trusted with her schedule and some of her professional frustrations, but not with very much else. Clara was 28, sharp-edged, socially gifted in the way that comes from going to the right schools and knowing the right families, and she had the kind of bone-deep confidence that Victoria had spent a decade carefully assembling as a simulation. "You cannot let 30 go by without marking it," Clara had said 6 weeks ago, leaning in the doorway of Victoria's office with her arms crossed and her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head. "I know you. You will spend the entire evening answering emails and eating takeout alone. That is not how we're doing this." Clara, rooftop of the Harrington, private event space, your guest list. We invite 100 people. We get the catering team that did the Merchant Group Gala. We do it right. She paused. "You've earned this, Victoria. Let people see that." Victoria had agreed, partly because Clara was right that she would have spent the evening alone, and some tired corner of her had wanted to do something other than work, partly because she knew the optics mattered, a CEO who didn't socialize, who didn't have a visible life outside the office, started to seem unstable to investors, and Victoria had learned to calculate everything through that particular lens. She had personally reviewed the guest list 3 times, and each time she had looked at the line where Ethan Carter's name should have been, where it existed only in the version of the list she carried in her head, and she had not added it. She told herself it was practical. Her father didn't know anyone in this crowd. He would be uncomfortable, out of place, overstimulated by the kind of people and settings that weren't part of his world. She told herself she was protecting him. She told herself this with the same precision she brought to everything else, and she almost believed it. The Harrington Hotel sat at the edge of downtown like something from a different era, a building that had been there long enough to have watched the city grow up around it, all limestone and brass and the particular authority that comes from genuine history rather than manufactured aesthetic. The rooftop terrace on the 42nd floor had a view that stopped most people mid-sentence when they first stepped out of the elevator and saw it. The whole city spread below in every direction, the harbor glittering to the east, the bridges lit up to the north. Victoria arrived at 6:15, 45 minutes before the first guests were scheduled to appear, because she always arrived early to anything she was hosting. She walked the space with Clara, moved 2 of the high-top tables 3 feet to the left, changed the playlist from what the catering manager had selected to something less aggressively cheerful, and stood at the bar for a moment with a glass of sparkling water, just breathing. "You look incredible," Clara said, appearing at her elbow. "Thank you." "I mean it. The burgundy was the right call." Victoria had spent 40 minutes choosing the dress. It was a deep wine red, fitted through the waist with a neckline that was confident without being performative. It was exactly the right dress for who she was supposed to be tonight. She had looked at herself in the full-length mirror before leaving her apartment and thought, yes, this is correct. She hadn't thought about Ethan. Or she had, and she had pushed it back down to wherever she kept the things she didn't let herself think about, and that was the same thing, or close enough. But guests began arriving at 7. This crowd, her crowd, she supposed, though she sometimes felt like a naturalist studying a particular ecosystem rather than a native resident of it, was the upper layer of Meridian's world. Portfolio managers, senior partners, the CFO, and 2 board members, the CEO of a real estate development firm they'd been in extended talks with, a pair of venture capitalists she'd met at a conference in Geneva the previous year. People who made decisions involving numbers with a lot of zeros. People who wore their success the way other people wore their skin, naturally, unconsciously, as though they'd been born inside it. She moved through it all with the practiced ease of someone who has done this enough times to know exactly where to stand and what to say and when to laugh. She was good at this. She had worked very hard to be good at this. Richard Ashworth, the CFO, found her at the east railing early in the evening and handed her a glass of champagne she hadn't asked for. "Happy birthday, Victoria. 30 looks expensive on you." Is that a compliment, Richard? Coming from me? It's the highest form of one. He clinked his glass against hers. Listen, I meant to tell you in the meeting Tuesday, but Hartman was monopolizing the room as usual. The Devereaux portfolio numbers are looking stronger than we projected. Your call on the Q3 rebalancing was correct. I know, she said. He laughed. He liked that she didn't pretend. She was mid-conversation with the venture capitalists, a married couple named Foley, both of them the precise kind of relentlessly pleasant that successful people perform at social functions, when she saw the elevator doors open, and she saw Ethan step out. Her first thought was, he came. Her second thought, and it arrived so fast behind the first that there was barely space between them, barely room to examine what happened in that gap, was, how do I make this okay? He looked exactly like himself. This sounds obvious, but it struck her as almost unbearable in that moment, that he was just so entirely himself, standing there in the entrance to this rooftop, where everyone else had spent considerable effort and money composing a version of themselves to present to the world. Ethan had not composed anything. He was wearing a blue flannel shirt she recognized. She was almost certain she'd seen it before, Christmas maybe 2 years ago. Dark jeans, boots that were clean but clearly work boots, not dress shoes. His hands, even from across the terrace, had the look that his hands always had, that particular texture that comes from decades of physical labor, the kind of texture that no amount of lotion or time entirely erases. He was carrying a gift, a box wrapped in grocery store paper, the kind with small printed stars on it, silver and gold. He was holding it in both hands, looking around the terrace with the careful attention of a man who has walked into an unfamiliar room and is doing the right thing by taking stock before moving forward. Then he saw her. His face did the thing it always did, a kind of opening. Not a big smile. Ethan was not a man of big smiles. He was a man of small, specific ones. But something in his expression settled and became warm in a way she felt across 40 feet of ambient conversation and catering noise and the faint sound of the city far below. He raised his hand, and Victoria's blood went cold. She excused herself from the Foleys with a phrase she couldn't have repeated 10 seconds later, and moved through the crowd on autopilot, keeping her trajectory angled to intercept Ethan before he moved deeper into the terrace, before anyone she knew saw them together, before what? Said a voice somewhere inside her that she was very good at ignoring. She got to him at the edge of the terrace, near the elevator lobby, where the noise of the party was slightly muffled. Dad? She kept her voice low, controlled. How did you know where? I called your office. He said it simply, like it was obvious, because to him it probably was. Young woman named Clara. She was very nice about it. Victoria made a mental note about Clara that she immediately felt ashamed of making. Dad, this is a work event. I know. He looked at her steadily. He was always steady, her father, even when she could see something behind his eyes that was less steady, a question, a kind of careful attention. His surface was always steady. I just wanted to stop in for a minute. I'm not staying. He held out the box. 30's a big one. I didn't want to just wire something. She stared at the box. Something moved through her that she couldn't categorize and didn't want to. Dad, She stopped, started again. Can you wait? Just wait here for a minute by the elevator, and I'll come back and we can step inside and have 5 minutes. But right now I need to... She saw his face change, just slightly. The warmth didn't disappear exactly, but it rearranged itself into something more guarded. And she had always known, she knew this man better than she knew almost anyone, that he understood exactly what was happening. Sure, he said, I'll wait. She went back to the party. She told herself she would return in 5 minutes. She told herself that. 14 minutes later, she was still in conversation with Richard and a man named Garrett Langley from the development firm, and she could see from the corner of her eye that Ethan was still standing where she'd left him, but he wasn't alone anymore. She couldn't hear the conversation from where she was. She would piece together most of it later from fragments, what Ethan told her, what one of the catering staff mentioned, and one burning piece that she witnessed directly. Marcus Webb was 44, a senior portfolio manager who'd been at Meridian for 12 years, and who operated with the automatic social cruelty of a man who had never in his adult life been in a room where he was the lowest status person. He was standing near the elevator lobby with two men she knew less well. Clients, she thought, or prospective ones. And he had noticed Ethan. She saw Marcus's attention land on her father the way a spotlight lands on something. Sudden, absolute. She saw him say something to the men beside him, and one of them looked, and they both made the particular facial expression that belongs to people who are finding something amusing at someone else's expense. She could not hear what was said. What she saw, Marcus Webb step toward Ethan and say something with a smile that was not friendly. What she saw, Ethan's jaw tighten just slightly and then release. What she saw, one of the other men gesture at Ethan's boots, and all three of them laugh with the specific ease of people who believe the target of their amusement cannot hurt them. What she saw, and this was the thing she would replay for a long time, Ethan standing there and taking it. Not crumpling, not embarrassed, just standing with a kind of quiet dignity that should have shamed everyone in the vicinity, and apparently didn't, because they kept going. And Victoria Sterling, CEO, 30 years old today, 10 feet away, stood inside a conversation she was not listening to and did nothing. She told herself she was frozen. She told herself she didn't know what to do. She told herself that intervening would make it worse, would draw attention, would... She was lying. She knew she was lying even as she told herself these things. The truth, the one she could not look at directly, was simpler. She was afraid of what it would cost her. She was afraid of what these people would know about her, what they would calculate about her. If she walked over there and said, "That is my father. The man you are laughing at raised me alone. He worked overtime for 18 years so I could go to a school that costs more per semester than he earns per year." She was afraid of them seeing through the dress and the carefully constructed biography to the girl from Culver's Creek who still lived somewhere inside her, in the place she'd sealed off and never visited. So she stayed where she was. She didn't see Ethan leave. She noticed he was gone only when she glanced toward the elevator and found the spot empty. Just the marble floor and the faint crowd noise and the gift he'd been carrying, which he'd apparently set down on one of the side tables near the entrance, the box with the silver and gold stars. Something happened in her chest when she saw it sitting there, something with the quality of a door closing. The party continued. It was a very good party, by every measurable standard. The food was excellent. The view was spectacular. People laughed at the right moments and circulated with the kind of confident fluidity that marks a successful social event. Richard gave a short toast that was warm without being sentimental. Someone from the marketing team's outside agency had organized a small arrangement of her professional accomplishments on a display near the bar. Promotion to VP at 24, youngest partner in Meridian's history at 27, named to a major financial publication's 40 Under 40 at 28. And several people stopped to look at it and then find her in the room and raise their glasses. Victoria accepted all of it with the gracious, practiced steadiness that was her professional signature. Inside, she was not steady. Inside, she was standing in a garage in Culver's Creek, 11 years old, handing up a torque wrench and listening to her father explain why an engine works the way it does. And she was also standing at the edge of this terrace watching Marcus Webb make her father the subject of a joke. And she was standing in both places at once and could not get out of either. She found the gift on the side table at some point near the end of the evening. She didn't open it there. She put it in her bag, and she didn't tell anyone what it was. After the last guests had gone, Richard left late. He always did. He liked to be the last to leave any room he was in. Victoria stood at the railing with the remnants of a glass of champagne she'd barely drunk, looking out at the city. Clara came to stand beside her. "Good night," Clara said. Not a question, a statement of fact. "Yes." "You okay?" Victoria considered the question. "Your idea to tell my father about the party." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He called the office. He wanted to know where you were celebrating. She stopped. "I thought it would be a nice surprise. I'm sorry if I overstepped." "You didn't know. Do you want to talk about—" "No," she said it quietly, without anger. Thank you for everything tonight, Clara. It was a genuinely excellent event. You should feel good about it. She could feel Clara looking at her. She kept her eyes on the harbor. Good night, Clara. She heard Clara's heels on the terrace floor, and then the sound of the elevator. And then she was alone up here with the city and the wind and the gift in her bag and everything she hadn't done tonight pressing against the inside of her ribs like something that needed to get out and couldn't find the opening. In the lobby of the Harrington, 42 floors below, she found him. She had not known he would still be there. She had half expected, had maybe half hoped, in the way that people hope for things that would let them off the hook, that he would have gone. Driven the 3 hours back to Culver's Creek. Put the evening behind him the way he seemed to put most things behind him, with the quiet pragmatism of a man who had learned that certain things cannot be fixed and have to be set down. But Ethan Carter was sitting in one of the lobby chairs near the entrance, a large leather chair that was slightly too big for the space, the kind of chair hotels put in lobbies because they want to suggest grandeur, not because they expect anyone to actually sit in them. He was sitting in it the way he sat everywhere, without performing anything, just occupying the space as a person who had a right to be there, which he did, though no one on the rooftop had apparently agreed. He was looking at the floor. Victoria stopped 5 feet away from him. He looked up. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The lobby had the particular quiet of late evening, the check-in desk staffed by a single young woman who was looking at a computer, the soft ambient music that hotels play to make silence feel deliberate, the sound of the revolving door turning every few minutes to admit or release someone from the night. Ethan's face, in the lobby light, looked older than she usually let herself notice. There were lines there that she remembered not being there. His hair, he still had all of it, dark with a significant amount of gray now, was slightly flattened on one side in a way that told her he'd driven with the window down. He had driven 3 hours for 5 minutes of standing next to an elevator, being laughed at by people who didn't know his name. The thing in her chest that had been pressing and pressing all evening found the opening it needed, and Victoria Sterling, who had not cried in front of another person in 6 years, felt her eyes fill. She didn't let it break. Not yet. She was not ready to not be composed, and some things about her were so deeply habituated that even now, even here, they held. "You didn't have to wait," she said. Her voice came out almost steady. "I know." He looked at her for another moment. "You left before I got to give you your present." "Dad, it's not much," he said. "I know you've got everything you need. It's just, I found something that I thought you might want." She crossed the lobby and sat down in the chair next to his. Up close, she could see the grease line under his thumbnail that never entirely washed out, no matter how carefully he cleaned his hands. She had seen that mark her entire life. When she was small, she had thought it was a tattoo. "What is it?" she said. "Open it." She took the box out of her bag. The star paper was slightly crumpled now from being in the bag, and one corner of the ribbon had come loose. She unwrapped it carefully. She had always unwrapped things carefully. It was one of the ways she was her father's daughter without knowing it, and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a photograph in a plain frame, black and white, printed on slightly textured paper. A garage. Not their garage. A bigger one, more industrial, but with the same quality of organized occupation, tools on pegboards, parts on shelves. And in the foreground, a man she didn't recognize at first, younger than she knew him, maybe 22 or 23, crouched next to an engine block with a focused expression that she recognized immediately because she had seen it her whole life. Ethan. Before she existed. Before everything she knew about him was true. And on the back, in his handwriting, "The year I figured out what I was for. 1996. She held it for a long time without saying anything. "I've been carrying that around for a while," Ethan said. "Thought maybe you'd want it. A piece of before." He paused. "Before me is just your dad. When I was also other things." She looked at him, and sitting in the leather lobby chair of the Harrington Hotel, 30 floors below the room where people had laughed at him and she had let them, Victoria Sterling thought about what she had done tonight and what it had cost, and whether any of the things she was so desperately protecting were actually worth what she had paid. She didn't say any of that, not yet. What she said was, "Thank you for coming." He nodded. Not performing forgiveness, not performing anything. "Drive safe," she managed. "Always do." He stood, put his hands in his pockets, and looked at her one more time with the expression she had been trying not to see all evening. Not hurt, exactly. Or not only hurt, but something more complex than that. Something that knew her. "Happy birthday, Vic," he said. And then he walked through the revolving door and out into the night. And she sat in the lobby chair with the photograph in her hands. And the city moved around her in all its indifferent enormity. And she stayed there for a long time before she could make herself stand up and go home. She drove home with the photograph on the passenger seat, not in her bag. On the seat where she could see it if she looked sideways at a red light, which she did, 3 times on the 12-minute drive back to Callaway Tower. Ethan, at 22, crouched next to an engine block with that focused expression. The year he figured out what he was for. She had not known that photograph existed. She had not known that version of him existed. Not in any tangible way, not as something she could hold. She knew the facts of his early life the way children know the facts of their parents' pasts. Abstractly, incompletely, assembled from fragments of overheard conversation and the occasional story told at the dinner table and then never followed up on. She knew he had worked at an industrial shop before going independent. She knew he had been good at what he did. She knew there had been a period, before she was born and just after, when things had been different for him. Bigger, maybe, more open to becoming other things. She had never asked very much about that period. It had not seemed relevant to who he was by the time she was old enough to be curious. By then, he was just her dad. The garage, the Sunday phone calls, the flannel shirt. She pulled into the parking structure under her building and sat in the car for a while with the engine off. The lobby attendant on the night shift, a man named Dennis who had worked the building for 11 years and who always nodded at her without trying to make conversation, which she appreciated, glanced up when she came through the main entrance and then looked back down at whatever he was reading. She took the elevator to 34 and stood in her apartment in the dark for a moment before she turned on a single lamp, the one on the side table near the window, and set the photograph on the kitchen counter where she could see it. She changed out of the wine-red dress and hung it carefully because it was expensive and she was constitutionally unable to be careless with expensive things. And then she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark in her bathrobe and did something she could not remember doing since the second year of her MBA, when the pressure had briefly exceeded her capacity to perform calm. She did nothing. Just sat there, listening to the building settle and the muffled sound of the city outside, and the particular silence of a life that has been very deliberately constructed to contain no unnecessary noise. She was thinking about Marcus Webb's face, the angle of his smile when he'd stepped toward Ethan, the way the 2 men beside him had looked at her father's boots. She was thinking about her own face in the same moment, what it had been doing, what it had been carefully not doing. She had a very precise memory, honed by years in rooms where the ability to read expression was a professional survival skill, and she knew exactly what her face had been doing. It had been arranged in the expression of a person engaged in a conversation she found moderately interesting. She had held it there the way you hold a door, with deliberate, sustained effort, while 40 feet away her father stood alone and absorbed whatever Marcus Webb was pleased to say to him. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. When she finally lay down, she did not sleep well. This was not unusual for her. She was a poor sleeper under the best of circumstances, a fact she had disclosed to no one at Meridian because in her industry, admitting to poor sleep felt like admitting to structural weakness. She lay on her back the way she'd woken up that morning. Was that only this morning? And stared at the ceiling and moved through the evening in her head with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to postmortems on failed investments, cataloging what had gone wrong and at what point and why. The analysis did not make her feel better. It was not supposed to. It was supposed to give her clarity, and it gave her that, though clarity and comfort were not the same thing, and she had known that long enough to not confuse them. What she understood, lying there at 1:45 in the morning on her 30th birthday. She had been given a choice tonight, and she had made it, and the choice had been wrong. Not in the way that a bad trade is wrong, not a miscalculation, not a failure of information, but in the deeper, less recoverable way that certain decisions are wrong, the kind of wrong that doesn't respond to correction, only to reckoning. She had let her father stand there. She had watched it happen. And somewhere in the crowd, Marcus Webb had gone back to his champagne, and the Foleys had probably gone on being relentlessly pleasant, and the whole apparatus of the evening had continued without interruption, and none of it had felt the weight of what she'd done by doing nothing. Only she felt it. She was still feeling it when she finally fell asleep at 3 in the morning, and it was the first thing she felt when she woke at 6. The photograph was still on the kitchen counter. She made coffee and looked at it while the machine ran. The year I figured out what I was for. She picked it up and turned it over and read his handwriting again, and then she put it face up and looked at his younger face and thought, I don't actually know what that means. I don't know what he figured out, or what led to it, or who was there, or what it cost him. I don't know this story. She had a lot of stories she didn't know. She put on her running shoes and went out before the city fully woke up, the way she did 3 mornings a week, and she ran her usual route along the harbor. 4 miles, the same loop she'd been running for 2 years since she moved to this apartment. And she ran it faster than usual, and it didn't help the way it usually did. She came back sweated through and stood in the shower for longer than she normally allowed herself, and then dressed for work and went in 2 hours early because that was what she did with things she couldn't resolve. She worked. She worked for 11 days before it caught up with her. The offices of Meridian Financial occupied the top 6 floors of a building 3 blocks from the Harrington, which meant that every morning when she walked to work, she passed it. She had walked past it before, hundreds of times over the years she'd been with the company, and it had simply been a building. Now, each morning for 11 days, she passed it and saw the rooftop terrace 42 floors up, and felt something clench in her sternum that she was increasingly losing the ability to dismiss as nothing. Her work did not suffer. Her work never suffered, which was part of the problem. She was so good at sealing things into separate compartments that the surface of her professional life continued to function at exactly its usual standard, while the things she'd sealed below it quietly generated pressure that had to go somewhere. It went into her relationship with Marcus Webb. She was not obvious about it. She was too controlled to be obvious. But she began to pay attention to him in a way she hadn't before the party. And the more she paid attention, the more she cataloged things she had previously smoothed over in the interest of functional professional relationships. The way he talked over the 2 junior analysts in Tuesday meetings, both of them young women, she noted. Both of them consistently correct in their assessments. Both of them consistently interrupted before completing a thought. The way he spoke about clients from outside the industry's usual demographic, as though their capital was slightly less legitimate by virtue of its origin. Small things. The kind of things that happen in every large financial institution and that senior leadership either addresses or permits by looking away. She had been looking away. She scheduled a one-on-one with him for the Thursday of the 2nd week. It was not a punitive meeting. She wasn't ready for that, and she wasn't sure punishing Marcus Webb was actually the point, or not the only point. The point she was beginning to understand was that she had spent years building a professional environment that reflected exactly the values she'd performed at parties rather than the ones she'd actually been raised with, and at some level she'd known that and chosen it, and she was only now fully seeing the cost. Marcus came into her office at 2 in the afternoon in the manner of someone who was confident the meeting was about something in his favor, a promotion discussion maybe, or a new portfolio assignment. He had that quality of forward momentum that certain men in certain industries cultivate as a substitute for actual attentiveness. Victoria. He sat across from her desk without being invited to, which he always did. Glad we could find time. I wanted to talk to you about the Brennan account. I want to talk about the birthday party. He stopped. Something shifted in his expression, a brief recalibration. Sorry? The man you spoke to near the elevator. At the Harrington. She kept her voice level. She was very good at level. The man in the flannel shirt. Marcus relaxed slightly. Too quickly, she noted. He put on the expression of a man deciding how to be magnanimous about a minor misunderstanding. Oh, was he a client? I apologize if I... He wasn't a client. Then, he was my father. The silence in the room had a specific quality. She had created silences like this before, in negotiations, in difficult performance reviews. The silence that happens when the actual terrain of a conversation becomes visible, and it's quite different from what someone expected. Marcus Webb sat in that silence for a moment with a face she found genuinely interesting to observe. She could see the calculation happening in real time, severity, exposure, correct response, available exits. Victoria, He stopped, started again. I didn't know. I had no idea he was. What did you say to him? Another pause, shorter this time. He was deciding how much she already knew, which was the right instinct, she supposed, from a self-preservation standpoint. I asked him if he was with the catering staff, I thought. And when he said he wasn't? The silence stretched. Marcus. She kept her tone the same, even, not warm, not cold, just exact. I'm going to be direct with you, and I'd like you to extend me the same courtesy. What happened at that party was embarrassing, not for me and not for my father, for you. I'd like you to understand that clearly because I think it's useful for you professionally, and I think you are smart enough, when you're not performing for an audience of two, to actually hear what I'm saying. He looked at her. There was no road out of this that he liked, and he seemed to know it, and so he did the next best thing, which was to stop trying to find one. I hear you. Good. She let a moment pass. We're going to talk in the next few weeks about some changes to how this team runs its meetings, how it structures feedback, how it communicates with junior staff. I'd like you to be part of that conversation, not on the receiving end of a policy memo. Actually, part of the conversation. He blinked. You're not... He stopped himself. I'm not what? I thought you were going to... I thought this was a different kind of meeting. What kind? He almost said it. She could see it forming, the kind where someone gets fired or disciplined or handed a formal consequence. He caught himself. A more formal kind. It may become one, she said. That depends partly on you. Right now I'm just telling you what I saw and what I expect, and I'm trusting you to do something useful with that. She held his gaze. My father built things, real things, with his hands that actually worked. He's the reason I'm sitting in this office, and that's not a metaphor. Literally. Without him, there's no me in this chair. I'd like you to carry that piece of information around for a while and see where it takes you. Marcus Webb left her office 15 minutes later looking like a man who'd expected a storm and gotten something harder to process. Clarity. She sat back in her chair after he left and exhaled. She had not said the thing she'd needed to say at the party. She'd said it 11 days late in an office on the 28th floor. It wasn't the same. It was not remotely the same, but it was something. And she had learned over years of doing difficult work that something was always the place you had to start. She called Ethan on a Sunday, which was their usual day, except she called at 9 in the morning instead of the early evening she normally managed. And she called not because she had worked out what to say, but because she had decided to stop waiting until she had. He picked up on the third ring. Hey, kiddo. His voice. She had grown up with his voice, and it still had the particular quality of making her feel like she was 11 years old and in the garage, which she suspected it always would. Hey. She was sitting at her kitchen counter with her coffee, the photograph still there beside the machine where it had been for 11 days. Are you busy? Just got in from the shop. Give me a second. She heard the sound of him moving, a door, water running briefly, the click of something being set down on a counter. Okay, what's up? Nothing's up, She stopped. I wanted to call earlier. I mean, not just today. I should have called earlier, after the party. The pause that followed was the length of a man choosing to wait rather than filling a space. I know, she said. I know I handled it badly. Victoria. Can you let me say it? I need to say it. Another pause. Then, simply, okay? She had not prepared language. She had spent 11 days carefully not preparing language because she knew herself well enough to know that if she prepared it, she would perform it, and performing this particular thing would defeat the entire purpose. So she sat at her counter and said it the way it actually was, which was halting and imprecise and not at all the way she talked in professional settings. I saw what was happening, she said, with those men, near the elevator. I saw it, and I didn't say anything. I didn't come over. I just stood there and let it happen. And the reason I let it happen is that I was scared of what they would think of me if they knew you were my dad. She heard him breathe. She pressed forward because stopping now would be worse than not starting. That's the truth. Not a comfortable version of it. I was ashamed, not of you. I mean, That's what's terrible about it, right? You didn't do anything to be ashamed of. I was ashamed of myself, of where I came from, of what they'd see if they saw us together. And I let that matter more than you did, and I don't. Her voice did something she hadn't authorized. She stopped for a moment. I don't know how to tell you how sorry I am for that. There's not a right way to say it. The silence on the line was long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Then Ethan said, "No, there's not. I know. I'm not. Look, I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt." His voice had its usual steadiness, but underneath it was something else, something that didn't usually surface. It hurt. Standing there like I didn't exist to you. That hurt, Victoria. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. I know. The words felt completely inadequate, and she said them anyway because they were true. I've been doing this your whole life, he said, trying to figure out what to be when you're around people from that world. Whether to... He stopped, and she could hear him working through something. Whether to just stay out of it. Let you have it without me making it complicated. You don't make it complicated. I know I do. He said it without resentment, just straightforwardly, the way he said everything. I know I'm not what they expect when they think of where you come from. I know my hands look wrong, and my truck looks wrong, and I don't know what half the things they're talking about at those parties mean. I know all that, and I made a decision a long time ago that I wasn't going to make you feel bad about the life you built, even if it meant keeping distance from it. That's not... She stopped, started again. That's not what I want. What do you want? She held the phone with both hands and looked at the photograph. The young man crouched next to an engine block 40 years ago, figuring out what he was for. I want to know who you are, she said. The whole version, not just my dad, the parts I don't know. I want... She pressed her thumbnail against the edge of the counter. I want to stop doing this. The thing I've been doing. Putting you somewhere separate from my life like you're something I need to manage. He was quiet. I don't know how to undo what I did at the party, she said. I can't, but I want to. I want to try to be different about this. I just don't exactly know how yet. Ethan was silent for long enough that she counted 7 seconds. You never could leave a problem alone until you'd pulled it apart, he said finally. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Where do you think I got that? I don't know what you're implying, he said, and the warmth in his voice was real and specific, and it moved through her like something she hadn't known she'd been cold without. They talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest phone call they'd had in 4 years. He told her about a job he'd just finished, a restoration on a 1968 Camaro for a collector in Columbus who kept changing his mind about the specifications, which Ethan relayed with the particular dry humor of a man who has dealt with every variety of client and maintains his equanimity out of practice rather than unlimited patience. She told him about the Marcus Webb meeting. Not all of it, but enough. He listened without commenting until she was done and then said, "Good," and she understood that he meant it. Before she hung up, she asked him about the photograph. Who was there? In 1996, what was that place? He was quiet for a moment, the way he got when something required him to go further back than he usually did. Industrial shop called Heartline Engineering. We did custom fabrication, heavy equipment repair, some engine work. He paused. There was a group of us back then. Young guys, mostly. It was a good time to be doing that kind of work. A lot of ideas floating around about what was possible with manufacturing, new processes. We were trying things. Who's we? Another pause. Longer. Bunch of people, like some of them stuck with it, some moved on to other things. He stopped there, and she had the sense that there was more in that pause than he was putting into words. A whole room full of something he hadn't decided yet whether to open. I'll tell you more sometime. It's a long story. I have time, she said. I have a lot of time, actually. She could hear him smile. She had always been able to hear it. I'll call you next Sunday, he said. Earlier, like this. Before I get into the shop. Okay. Victoria. Yeah. Thank you for calling. She held the phone for a moment after they hung up, and then she set it down on the counter next to the photograph and finished her coffee while the morning light moved across the kitchen floor, and she thought about the story she didn't know yet, The one living in the pause between a group of us and I'll tell you more sometime. And she felt the specific appetite of someone who has been eating around something for years and has just realized how hungry they actually are. She found out about Jonathan Hayes by accident. It was 3 weeks after the party, on a Tuesday, when she was reviewing the background materials for a potential partnership deal that the M&A team had flagged. Hayes Industrial was expanding its commercial real estate holdings as a diversification strategy, and the preliminary analysis suggested an interesting alignment with two of Meridian's mid-tier portfolio positions. She'd asked the analyst, a meticulous 25-year-old named Priya, to put together a full profile on Hayes and the company. Priya left the folder on her desk that afternoon, and Victoria read it that evening after most of the floor had cleared out. Jonathan Hayes, 51, founder and chairman of Hayes Industrial, a diversified manufacturing and infrastructure company with operations across 11 states. Net worth estimated at somewhere north of $4 billion, depending on the quarter and the performance of the private holdings. Famously press-averse, relatively few profiles, almost no personal interviews, a public presence that was large in financial circles and essentially invisible outside them. Originally from the Midwest. Had started his first company in his mid-20s with a partner whose name was mentioned only briefly in the older biographical material, usually in the phrase founding team without much elaboration. She read the folder twice. Then she went back to an early profile from a business journal, written when Hayes was 30 and his first company had just been acquired for a number that made people pay attention. The journalist had asked him what the turning point had been, when he'd known the company would work. Hayes had given an answer she would have found unremarkable in any other context. I had a mentor, he'd said. An older guy. Well, he was probably 28, 30, so not that much older, but he seemed older. He knew machines the way some people know music. I watched him take apart an engine once and put it back together in the dark, just to prove a point about what you can know with your hands when your eyes aren't in the way. I learned everything I know about building things that actually work from watching that man think. She put the folder down on her desk, sat back in her chair. He knew machines the way some people know music. She picked up her phone and called a number she hadn't dialed in 2 years. An old contact from her time in the Chicago office, a woman named Frances, who had spent 20 years in financial intelligence and knew the connective tissue of the industry the way other people knew their own family trees. Victoria Sterling, Frances said when she picked up. I heard you turned 30. Are you finally interesting? I need background on Jonathan Hayes, real background, not the press profile. A pause. Hayes Industrial Hayes? Yes. That's a long lunch. Dinner, Victoria said. This week, my treat. Frances was quiet for a moment. You know he's going to be in the city Thursday, some conference at the Harrington. Victoria looked at the window. The Harrington. I know, she said, though she hadn't known until right now. Thursday, I'll make the reservation. She hung up and sat for another moment in the quiet of the mostly empty floor, and then she picked up the Hayes folder again and turned back to the early profile and read the paragraph about the mentor one more time. She was building a picture. She wasn't certain yet what it showed. She went home, and the photograph was on the counter where it always was now, and she looked at it for a while before she turned off the kitchen light. Heartline Engineering, 1996. A group of us. She thought about the long story Ethan had said he'd tell her sometime. She thought about what was in the pause. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, moving, accumulating, indifferent. And somewhere out on the highway, she thought, her father was probably already home, washing the day's grease off his hands at the shop sink, listening to whatever he listened to in the evenings, thinking or not thinking about the things that had happened and not happened and might still happen yet. She did not know what Thursday would reveal. She did not know if the picture she was building was the one she thought it was, and she was experienced enough in the work of assembling incomplete information to know that certainty at this stage would be a mistake. What she knew was this: the story was bigger than she had understood. The version of Ethan Carter she carried in her head, the dad, the garage, the flannel shirt, the Sunday phone calls, was not wrong, but it was partial. It was the part of the man she had let herself see. She was beginning to wonder what she'd missed by not looking harder. She put the folder in her bag to read again in the morning, and she went to bed, and this time she slept better than she had in 3 weeks. Frances Okafor was 62 years old, had worked in financial intelligence for longer than Victoria had been alive, and had the particular quality of someone who had spent decades knowing things other people didn't. Not the sharp-edged knowingness of someone who uses information as currency, but the settled, specific knowingness of someone who has simply been paying attention for a very long time. She wore her silver hair natural, kept her nails short, and had a habit of arriving exactly on time to everything, which Victoria respected deeply. She was already at the table when Victoria got to the restaurant Thursday evening, which meant she had arrived 5 minutes early, because the table wasn't reserved until 7, and Victoria had walked in at 6:58. A glass of water in front of her, a folder, paper, actual paper, which was Frances's signature stubbornness against an industry that had gone entirely digital, sitting beside her silverware. "You look tired, chum," Frances said as Victoria sat down. "Thank you, Frances. You look exactly the same as always." "I am exactly the same as always. It's a conscious choice." She pushed the water glass a few inches to the left, which seemed to satisfy some spatial requirement. "You want to know about Hayes?" "I want to know the real version." "The real version is complicated." She opened the folder and turned it so Victoria could see the first page. Not a printed document, but a handwritten summary, which was Frances's method, and also why she was worth 3 times what most people charge for this kind of work. Hayes Industrial. Jonathan Hayes. What do you know? Victoria recounted the profile. Frances listened without interrupting, which was another of her qualities that Victoria had always found useful in contrast to most people in their industry who listened primarily to identify where they could insert their own expertise. When Victoria finished, Frances tapped the folder once. "The part you're missing," she said, "is the beginning. The press has the acquisition, the scale-up, the portfolio diversification. Nobody ever went back and really looked at the first company, because by the time Hayes became interesting enough to profile, the first company had been dissolved and the founding period was just background. Prehistory." She turned 2 pages in. "Hayes started in manufacturing, custom fabrication and heavy equipment, Midwest region. His first real operation was called Heartline Engineering. He wasn't the founder, he was the second in. The actual founder was a machinist named Carter." Victoria's hand stopped moving. Frances looked at her. "You've heard that name." "Keep going." Frances studied her for a moment, the careful look of someone deciding whether to pursue a thread, and then returned to the page. Carter and Hayes built Heartline together starting in the early 90s. By all accounts, Carter was the technical genius of the operation, held patents on 2 fabrication processes that are still in use in modified forms today. Hayes had the business instincts, the relationship building. He was the one who got them in front of investors, got them the contracts. They were apparently a good match. Heartline was on a solid trajectory by the mid-90s. Victoria was looking at the table. She was not seeing the table. "What happened?" she said. Frances was quiet for a moment in a way that told Victoria the next part had weight. Carter's wife got sick, serious. The treatment costs were... This was a time before certain insurance protections existed, and they were significant. Carter needed liquidity fast. Hayes offered to buy out his share of the company at what he could raise on short notice, which was... She turned a page. Not what it was worth. Not close to what it was worth, actually. The company was in good shape. That share should have been worth multiple millions. Carter sold it for something in the low 6 figures. Victoria was very still. Hayes tried to renegotiate later, Frances continued. Multiple times, from what I could find. By the time he sold Heartline and started building what became Hayes Industrial, he was worth enough to make Carter whole, and then some. Offered repeatedly. From what I can piece together, Carter declined every time. "Why?" Victoria said it before she'd decided to. Frances looked at her. "I don't know. I don't have Carter's side of it. What I have is Hayes's public comments in one interview, he gave very few, where he was asked about mentors, and he said that the man who taught him the most about business was also the most stubborn person he'd ever met, in the specific way of someone who had decided what he was going to owe and what he wasn't, and nothing Hayes said moved him." Victoria put her hands flat on the tablecloth and looked at them. "Victoria," Francis's voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but different, more personal. Do you want to tell me what I'm actually looking at here? She looked up. Francis met her gaze with the patience of someone who had earned the right to wait. Carter, Victoria said. Ethan Carter. He's my father. Francis was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then she closed the folder. How much does he know about what that company became? I don't know. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. I don't know how much he followed it. I never asked. I didn't know to ask. He sold a share worth millions for a fraction of that, Francis said. Not an accusation. Just a fact, stated with the precision of someone who works in numbers. And then declined to be made whole, and your father has been a machinist in Culver's Creek, Ohio. The words felt strange in her mouth, in this context. He has his own shop now, small operation. He does good work. I'm sure he does. Frances picked up her water glass, then set it down. Hayes is at the Harrington conference right now. He's presenting tomorrow morning, but his team told me he's attending the networking reception tonight. Victoria looked at her. What floor? 42nd, Frances said. Same as last time. There was a moment. The restaurant moved around them. Other tables, other conversations. The sound of a kitchen working and the muted sound of the street outside. And Victoria sat inside all of it and felt the specific vertigo of understanding that a story she thought she knew had an entire dimension she hadn't been able to see from where she was standing. I need to make a call, she said. I assumed. She stepped outside onto the sidewalk, the November air cold enough to be sharp, and called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring this time. Hey, thought we were Sunday. We are. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. A pause. I'm always straight with you. Heartline Engineering, she said. Jonathan Hayes. The silence that followed was different from his other silences. She had cataloged his silences over 30 years, the thoughtful ones, the reluctant ones, the ones that meant he was deciding, the ones that meant he'd already decided but wasn't ready to say, and this one was the kind that meant she'd found a door he hadn't shown her. Where'd you hear that name? He said finally. Does it matter? Yeah, a beat. A little bit. I'm doing preliminary research on a potential deal. Hayes Industrial came up. I pulled the background. It goes back further than the public record makes obvious. She waited. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? Another silence. She heard him exhale. Not a sigh, just the particular breath of a man who is putting something down, getting ready to pick up something else. Because it didn't seem like something that needed telling. You sold your share of a company that became worth billions for enough to cover Mom's medical bills. It was enough to cover her medical bills, he said. That was what I needed it for. You could have... Victoria. His voice was gentle but clear. Jonathan needed it to stay alive. Heartline needed that buyout to stay alive long enough to become what it became. If I'd held my share, he might not have been able to get the next round of financing, and the whole thing might have gone under anyway. I made a decision. It was the right decision for that moment. He tried to pay you back. A pause. Several times. And you said no. I said no. Why? He was quiet for a moment, and she could hear that he was choosing words with the care he used for things that mattered and were hard to get right. Because Jonathan Hayes worked for what he built. Worked hard. Made smart calls. Made some bad ones. Built something real. What he has is his. I didn't want a piece of it just because I knew him early. That's not how I want things to work. Dad, that share was yours. You earned it. I spent it, he said simply, on your mother and on raising you, and I would spend it exactly the same way if I had to do it again tomorrow. He paused. I don't need Jonathan Hayes' money, Victoria. I have my shop. I have my work. I have enough. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and felt something cracking open in her chest that she didn't have adequate language for. He's going to be at the Harrington tonight, she said. A pause. I heard there was some industry thing. Did you know he'd be there? I knew about the conference. He said it carefully. Have you been in touch with him? On and off, over the years? He paused. We're not strangers. We're not... I don't know what we are exactly. Old friends is probably too simple. We know each other. She pressed the phone harder against her ear. Are you going to come? The silence stretched long enough that she thought he might say no. Then, I wasn't planning to. But I thought about coming down to the city anyway. See the exhibit at the art museum, maybe. Check the truck into a shop I like on the east side that has the right lift for the rear suspension work I need done. He paused. I thought I might drive down tonight. She understood suddenly that he had been thinking about this longer than she had, that the information had reached him through channels she didn't know about, and that he had been sitting with the question of whether to come, to the city, to the Harrington, to the orbit of a history he'd mostly left alone, and that he hadn't quite answered it yet. Come, she said. I'll be there. The reception at the Harrington's 42nd floor started at 8. She was there at 7:50, standing at the bar with a glass of sparkling water. She was not drinking tonight. She wanted all her faculties. And watching the space fill with the particular density of a financial and industrial conference crowd, people who built things, and people who financed the building of things, and people who existed in the productive tension between those two functions. She spotted Hayes within 10 minutes of his arrival. He was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have articulated before tonight exactly what she'd been expecting. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that takes up space in a room not through performance but through simple volume. His hair was gray-white, kept short, and he had a weathered quality that reminded her, unexpectedly, of Ethan. Not in feature or detail, but in texture, the way certain men who've spent significant time doing real physical work carry it in the surface of their skin and the way they hold themselves. He was moving through the room with the ease of someone who has nothing left to prove, which was both earned and visible. He was also, she noticed, scanning the room in a way that was just slightly different from the social scan most people do at these events. Not looking for opportunity, looking for something specific. She was still watching him from across the room when she heard the elevator. And when the doors opened and Ethan Carter stepped out, carrying nothing this time, in the same boots and a dark canvas jacket she didn't recognize, looking around with the same careful inventory he'd done 3 weeks ago, she saw the moment Jonathan Hayes saw him. It stopped him mid-sentence. The man Hayes had been talking to, she didn't know him, some executive in a good suit, continued speaking for several seconds without noticing that Hayes's attention had left the conversation entirely. Hayes crossed the terrace in the kind of direct line that ignores every social obstacle in its path, and the crowd parted for him, partly because he was Jonathan Hayes, and partly because he was moving with the unambiguous momentum of a man who has just seen something important. He reached Ethan before Ethan had taken 5 steps from the elevator. The room did not immediately notice. This happened in the peripheral zone of the party, not center stage, and Victoria was watching only because she'd been watching from the moment the elevator opened. But she was close enough. She had maneuvered herself close enough over the last 40 minutes, she could admit that, to see it. Hayes stopped in front of Ethan, and then, in a voice that was not performing for any room, not modulated for any audience, that came from somewhere lower and more fundamental than social calculation, Jonathan Hayes said one word: boss. The room did not go silent. Rooms do not go silent on command, but there was a ripple of it, the way a ripple moves through water. The 2 men nearest heard something in the quality of that single word, and looked. And then the woman beside them looked because they did, and it propagated outward in a wave of redirected attention until, inside of 30 seconds, a significant portion of the room was looking at 2 men standing by the elevator who appeared to be in a different conversation from everyone else in the space. Ethan looked at Jonathan Hayes for a long moment. His expression was the thing Victoria was watching most carefully, because she knew his expressions better than anything. What she saw: recognition first. Then something more complex beneath it, something that involved years and distance and a shared history that had more rooms in it than she'd understood. John, Ethan said, just the name. No fanfare. Hayes put out his hand and Ethan shook it, and then Hayes did something she hadn't expected. He pulled Ethan into a brief, hard embrace, the kind men of their generation do when they mean it and don't know another way to show it, one hand on the shoulder and a clap on the back that had actual weight behind it. I didn't know you were coming, Hayes said. I didn't know I was either. Ethan glanced around the room with the mild, accurate eye of a man taking stock. You've got a full house. I've got a room full of people I need to be polite to. He said it without moving his attention from Ethan's face. It's good to see you. You too. Victoria was 6 feet away. Neither of them had looked at her yet. And then Hayes did, because Hayes was the kind of man who was aware of everything in a room at all times. He looked at her, and she could see the calculation happen fast. Who she was, where she was standing relative to Ethan, what that meant. And his expression shifted into something that had a question in it. John, Ethan said, this is my daughter, Victoria. Hayes looked at her fully. She had the strange experience of being seen by someone who already knew something significant about her without having met her. He knew who she was, she realized, not just professionally. He knew whose daughter she was, which meant he knew the shape of the story she'd grown up in, more of it than she'd known herself until tonight. Victoria Sterling, he said. He shook her hand. His grip was what she expected. Firm, the particular firmness of someone who has built things with his hands. I've heard your name, the Meridian work. I've been reading your background material, she said. The full version. He looked at her for a moment, then at Ethan, then back at her. Ah, he said. Ah, Ethan said. Your daughter, Hayes said to Ethan, has been doing her homework. She always did, Ethan said, and the warmth in it was so unguarded that Victoria had to look away for a moment at some middle distance until she had herself back. The three of them moved to a quieter section of the terrace, near the east railing where the view opened up over the harbor, away from the main density of the crowd. Victoria noticed, as they moved, that the room's attention followed Hayes with the persistent awareness that a certain level of wealth generates in a room, and that several people clocked the group with the calculating interest of people trying to determine whether this was a meeting they should be inserted into. She also noticed that Marcus Webb was in the room. She had not registered him when she arrived. She registered him now, standing at the far end of the bar with a pair of colleagues, holding a glass of something amber, and facing the general direction of where she, Ethan, and Hayes had just come from. She watched his face in the moment that he understood what he was looking at. The sequence of it. He recognized Hayes, everyone in this room recognized Hayes, and then he looked at who Hayes was standing beside, and then he recognized Ethan, and she could see the recalibration happen in real time, the information arriving in the wrong order for the understanding he'd constructed 3 weeks ago to survive intact. The man in the flannel shirt, standing with Jonathan Hayes, standing with her. She did not look away when Marcus found her eyes across the room. She held it for a moment, not hostile, just clear, and then turned back to her father and Hayes and the conversation she was actually here to be part of. I've been trying to get him to let me do something useful for 15 years, Hayes was saying, gesturing at Ethan with the easy familiarity of someone resuming a long-standing argument. Something with teeth, not a consultant fee, not a token share, actually meaningful. And I've been telling you for 15 years, Ethan said, in a tone that was entirely unconcerned, that I don't need it. That's not the point. John. No, Victoria, tell him. Hayes turned to her with the expression of a man recruiting an ally. The work he did at Heartline was foundational. We were using his fabrication processes for the first 8 years of Hayes Industrial. I've put it in writing. My legal team has put it in writing. It belongs to him. It belongs to whoever built what I built off it, Ethan said, which is you. That's not how it works. That's how I work. He said it the same way he'd said it on the phone, quietly and without heat, the tone of a man who has thought about this enough times that the decision doesn't require reconsideration. John, I know what you're trying to do. I've always known, and I appreciate it, I do. But I made my choices, and they were mine to make, and I don't need you to fix them. Hayes looked at him for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not an amused laugh, more the laugh of someone who has run out of angles on a problem and can recognize an impasse. You are the most impossible person I've ever worked with. You say that like it's a complaint. It is a complaint. Hasn't stopped you from calling every few months for 20 years. No, Hayes said. It hasn't. He looked at Ethan with something that didn't translate easily into professional language. Something more personal, more specific. The way you look at someone who taught you something you couldn't have learned anywhere else. It hasn't stopped me. Victoria had been quiet through this exchange, taking it in the way she took in difficult information, attentively, without rushing the analysis, letting the full shape of it become visible before she tried to name it. Now she said, "Can I ask you something?" Both men looked at her. She kept her eyes on Hayes. "In the interview, the early one, in the business journal, you talked about a mentor, someone who put an engine back together in the dark." Hayes smiled. It was a real one, with memory in it. "He made me sit in the corner and watch. Said I couldn't talk or move until he was done. I was 23 years old and I thought I knew quite a bit about machinery." He glanced at Ethan. "I did not know very much about machinery." "What was the point," Victoria asked, "of doing it in the dark?" Hayes looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the harbor. There was something between them in that moment that had the quality of a long-standing private language, the particular shorthand of two people who had spent significant time working in close proximity towards something real. "Tell her," Hayes said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "The point was that when you can't see what you're doing, you have to understand it, not recognize it, not remember the order of the steps. Actually understand why each piece exists and what it does and what it connects to. That's the only way your hands know where to go." He paused. "Most people learn to follow a procedure. That's fine for most things, but if you want to be able to work on anything, not just the machines you already know, but anything, you have to understand the principles underneath the procedure. The dark just removes the shortcut." The harbor lights moved on the water below them. "I've been using that since the day he showed me," Hayes said. "In everything, not just engines." Victoria looked at her father. He was looking at the water, the mild, specific expression of someone who is somewhere partially in the present and partially in a year that was a long time ago. The young man from the photograph crouched next to an engine block, figuring out what he was for. "Why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" she said. Not an accusation, a real question. Ethan looked at her. "You never asked." It was a simple answer. It landed on her like something falling from a height. She had not asked. She had spent years carefully not asking. She had built her life at a deliberate distance from his. And in that distance, she had missed an entire dimension of who he was. The engineer, the mentor, the man who had understood something fundamental about how things work and had passed it on to someone who'd built $1 billion enterprise with it, and who had then walked away from the credit and the money and the recognition and gone back to Culver's Creek and opened a small shop and worked with his hands because that was what he wanted his days to look like. She had been ashamed of that version of him without knowing it. She had hidden him from the people in her industry without knowing that the people in her industry, the ones who actually knew exactly who he was. "How many people in that room know the Heartline story?" she said to Hayes. He glanced over his shoulder at the crowd. "The serious ones, the ones who've been around long enough to know the genealogy." He looked back at her. "Your father is not unknown in this industry, Victoria. He's just quiet." She thought about the rooftop 3 weeks ago, the party, Marcus Webb's angle of approach, the men who'd laughed at the boots and the truck. They had not been serious ones. They had not been the ones who'd been around long enough. She thought about what it would have looked like, what it would have felt like to stand up in that moment and say his name, to say, "That is my father, and I would like to tell you who he is." She had not done it. She had stood there and done nothing, and now she was standing on the same terrace with the truth laid out in front of her, and the only thing between the person she'd been 3 weeks ago and the person she was right now was a folder on her desk and a phone call to Francis and a drive her father had made without quite deciding to make it. "I want to tell you something," she said. She said it to Ethan, but Hayes didn't move, and she didn't ask him to. Ethan looked at her. He waited. 3 weeks ago, on this terrace, I let someone treat you badly, and I didn't stop it. And I've said I'm sorry, and I meant it, and I'm still sorry. But standing here right now, I realize—" She stopped. The harbor was silver and black below them, the bridges lit. "The part I was most ashamed of wasn't where I came from. It was who I'd become by trying to leave it behind. The version of me that stood there and said nothing. That's not who you raised me to be." Ethan was quiet. "I know," he said. He said it the same way he'd said it on the phone. Not absolution, just acknowledgement. Honest and simple. I'd like to be someone different about it. She felt the inadequacy of the language even as she used it. I don't entirely know what that looks like yet, but I'd like to try. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The careful steadiness of his face had something working underneath it that she recognized from very few moments in her life. The handful of times she'd seen her father close to something he wouldn't let break the surface. The night her mother's last test came back. The morning she'd left for university. Moments where the container of his composure was doing real, effortful work. "You know what you did tonight?" he said. She shook her head. "You showed up," he said. "Not to a party, not to a room full of people you needed something from. You drove here and you found me and you—" He stopped. "That's not nothing, Victoria. That's actually the whole thing." Hayes, who had been standing slightly apart with the tact of someone who knew when to be present and when to step back, said quietly, "He used to say the same thing on the floor when somebody made a mistake and they wanted to tear themselves apart over it." He looked at Ethan. "Remember what you'd tell them?" Ethan said nothing, but something in his expression shifted. Hayes said it himself. "You'd say, the floor doesn't care about yesterday. What are you building today?" The three of them stood at the railing with the city below and the conversation of the room behind them, and Victoria held those words for a moment the way you hold something you've been handed and haven't decided yet where to put. "What are you building today?" Behind them, she was aware of the room continuing, the ambient industry of people talking and networking and being professional in their various ways. And she was aware of Marcus Webb somewhere in it, and the Foleys, and Richard if he was here, and all the careful scaffolding of the version of herself she'd constructed for their benefit. She was aware of all of it the way you're aware of weather, present, real, something to be accounted for. But it was not the most important thing on the terrace. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at the harbor again, something settled in his posture now that hadn't been there when he stepped off the elevator. Something that looked like a man who had driven 3 hours, not sure whether he was supposed to be here, and had arrived at an answer. She thought about the photograph on her kitchen counter. 1996. The year I figured out what I was for. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Will you tell me the rest of the story? The Heartline years?" "All of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a very long story." "I know." She looked at him. "I have time." Hayes made a quiet sound beside them, something between a laugh and an exhale, and didn't say anything, and the harbor moved below them, patient and immense. And the city did what it always did, and the three of them stood at the edge of a rooftop where, 3 weeks ago, a story had cracked open, and where now something was beginning, not cleanly, not perfectly, in the particular uneven way that real beginnings always go, to fill in the light. They left the Harrington at 10:30. Not together. Hayes had obligations. A dinner with 3 board members that had already been pushed back twice, and he extracted himself with the particular efficiency of a man who has learned to leave rooms without making it a production. He shook Ethan's hand again, held it a beat longer than the first time, and said something low that Victoria couldn't hear. Ethan nodded. Whatever passed between them in that moment had the quality of something that didn't need witnesses. Hayes turned to Victoria before he left. "Your father tells me you're one of the sharpest people in mid-market portfolio management right now." She glanced at Ethan, who was looking at the harbor with an expression of complete innocence. "He's biased," she said. "Probably," Hayes said. "Doesn't make it wrong." He held out a card, a plain one, just a name and a number, the kind of card that belongs to someone who doesn't need to explain who they are. "Call me sometime. Not about the deal, about other things." She took the card. He left, and the particular gravitational field that certain people generate in rooms left with him, and the terrace recalibrated around his absence the way rooms do. Victoria stood beside her father at the railing, and they watched the harbor for a few minutes without talking, which was one of the things they had always been able to do. Share silence without filling it, a habit from the garage where Ethan had taught her that not every moment needed narration. "Hungry?" he said finally. "Starving, actually." "There a diner near here?" "Not—" He gestured vaguely at the elegance of the Harrington. "Something that has pie. I know a place." They walked 6 blocks south to a diner called Paulette's, that had been there since before the neighborhood gentrified and had so far declined to update its aesthetic to reflect the changed surroundings. Same red vinyl booths, same laminated menus, same overhead lighting that was slightly too bright and made everyone look approximately the same. Victoria had been coming here since her second year at Meridian, usually alone, usually late, when she needed food and didn't want an experience about it. The waitress, a woman in her 50s named Helen, who recognized Victoria with a nod and set down 2 water glasses without being asked, handed them menus they didn't look at for a moment. "The Heartline story," Victoria said. Ethan opened his menu. "You're not going to let me eat first." "You can eat while you talk." "Victoria." "Dad." He looked at her over the menu with the expression of someone who has been outmaneuvered and knows it. He set the menu down. "What do you want to know?" "Everything you skipped." He was quiet for a moment, hands flat on the table. The diner moved around them. A couple in the back corner, a man alone at the counter with a newspaper, Helen refilling someone's coffee with the practiced economy of someone who has done this 10,000 times. "I was 24 when I started at Heartline," he said. "It wasn't my company at first. I was hired on as a fabrication specialist. The owner was a man named Bud Kowalski, 60-some years old, had been running the shop since the 70s. Good man, better machinist than businessman. He was losing contracts because his equipment was aging and he didn't have the capital to update it." He paused. "I had some ideas about process that I thought could compensate. Talked Bud into letting me try. Worked out." "The patents," Victoria said. He looked at her. "Frances Okafor." "She's thorough." "Yeah." A brief thing crossed his face, not quite amusement. "The patents were a surprise to everybody, including me. I filed them because John said I should, and John was usually right about the business side." He accepted the coffee Helen brought without being asked and turned the cup twice in his hands the way he always did. Jonathan Hayes showed up at Heartline in '93. Bud had put out some quiet interest in outside investment. John was 25, had a little money from a family situation, not a lot, but enough to matter to a small shop. He came in to look around and ended up staying. He paused. "I didn't like him at first." "Why?" "He talked too much." He said it plainly. "Had an opinion about everything and expressed all of them. I was used to the shop being quiet except for work sounds and necessary conversation. John brought in a lot of extra conversation." Victoria smiled before she could stop it. "But he was right most of the time," Ethan said. That was the irritating part. "He had a way of seeing the business side of things that I didn't have and genuinely didn't want. I could build anything. I couldn't sell anything. Didn't have the patience for it. John could sell a thing before it existed, which is a skill I don't have a name for, but it's real." "So you were the product and he was the pitch." "More or less. We fought about that split constantly." He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "But it worked. By '95, we had 12 employees and more contracts than we could fill. We were building custom equipment for 3 manufacturing clients in the region. And I'd developed a process for high-tolerance machining on secondary materials that nobody else in the area was doing. John had gotten us in front of 2 investors in Columbus who were interested in scaling." He stopped. "Then your mother got sick." The diner was quiet around them for a moment. Victoria had known the broad shape of this. Her mother, Diane Carter, had died of ovarian cancer when Victoria was 7. She had a child's memory of it, fragmented, sensory rather than narrative. The smell of the hospital. Her father's face doing the thing it did when he was working very hard to hold something in. The neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, Bud's wife, she realized now, making a connection she'd never made. Who used to come and sit with Victoria in the evening so Ethan could be at the hospital. She had not known the financial part. She had not known, or had not put together, what the timing had meant for Heartline. "How bad was it?" she said. "Financially. Bad." He said it without drama. The treatment was aggressive, which is what gave us the most time together at the end. Aggressive also means expensive. Insurance covered some of it. Not enough. He turned the mug again. "I talked to John. He didn't hesitate. He offered to buy my share immediately. He didn't have the liquid capital to pay what it was actually worth. The company was in good shape, but not that kind of liquid. But he had enough to cover the immediate medical costs and then some. He made it as generous as he could. It was still far below market value. It was what he had, Ethan said simply, and it was what I needed. The math worked out for both of us. Helen came and took their order. Ethan got the meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Victoria, who had been intending to get something light, heard herself order the same. Helen left without comment. He wanted to restructure after, Ethan said. Give me equity in the successor company. I said no. Why? She'd asked this on the phone. She asked it again here, because she wanted the full version. He thought about it for a moment, turning his coffee mug in that slow rotation. Because by the time he could afford to do it, the situation had changed. He'd built something genuinely his. The processes I'd developed had been absorbed and improved on and built into something larger. I wasn't part of that building. I was on the front end, taking a share at that point. He shook his head. It would have felt like collecting rent on someone else's house. The house had moved on without me. That's not how equity works. I know how equity works. He said it mildly. I'm telling you how I work. She looked at him across the table. The too bright lighting of Paulette's showed everything. The lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the hands on the mug that had been doing physical work for 30 years. She had been looking at this face her entire life, and she was still, at 30, finding things in it she hadn't seen. Were you angry? She said. About any of it, the timing, selling when you did. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered things. For a while I was tired, he said. Tired is close enough to angry that they're hard to tell apart sometimes, especially when you're young. Your mother passed 8 months after the surgery. I had you. I had the shop. Bud let me come back and work, which was the right thing for that period. I needed something concrete to do with my hands and my brain, or I would have... He stopped. I would have been in worse shape than I was. She waited. But angry at the situation? At John? No. He shook his head. John did the best he could with what he had. And the situation was just the situation. Your mother was sick. That was the fact. Everything else was just how we responded to the fact. He paused. The only thing I've ever been angry about is that I couldn't fix it. And you can't be angry at that for too long before it becomes something useless. Helen brought their food. They ate for a few minutes without talking, and it was a real silence. Not uncomfortable, not loaded, just two people eating in a diner at night with a long conversation resting between them. I should have asked you about this years ago, Victoria said. Probably. Why didn't you bring it up? Any of it? He cut into the meatloaf. You were building your life. I didn't want to hand you a complicated piece of history that might... He stopped, found the word. Complicated. You had enough to figure out. I was hiding you, she said, and you were protecting me. And both of those things were happening at the same time, and we never talked about it. He was quiet. That's pretty messed up, she said. He looked up at her, and she caught the corner of something in his expression, the almost laugh of a man who finds something genuinely funny that he probably shouldn't find funny. Yeah, he said, it's a little messed up. We should fix it. We're working on it. She pointed at him with her fork. I'm serious. I know you're serious. You've been serious since you were 4 years old. He ate a bite. Victoria, I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you. We have time. She looked at him. You said that about the story too. And I'm telling it, aren't I? She sat back in the booth. Outside the diner window, the city moved in its nighttime mode. Fewer people, faster cars, the particular quality of a city street after 10 o'clock when the daytime density has thinned to its essential elements. She had lived in this city for 8 years, and she still sometimes looked at it with the faint foreignness of someone who arrived from somewhere else. Hayes wants you involved in something, she said. Something bigger than just keeping in touch. Ethan ate, didn't respond immediately. I heard some of what he said tonight, she continued. The things he didn't say in front of me were visible in the things he did. He's been working up to something. John's always working up to something, Ethan said. It's his primary mode of being. What does he want? Ethan set down his fork. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at problems in the garage, with the patient, full attention of someone who has decided to actually deal with something rather than work around it. He wants to build a training program, skilled trades, apprenticeships in manufacturing and fabrication for young people coming out of the workforce development system, kids who aged out of high school without a college track, adults making career changes, veterans with mechanical aptitude but no credentials. He paused. He's been funding the research for it for 2 years. He thinks it can scale nationally. He wants me to help design the curriculum and run the pilot. Victoria looked at him. "Why you?" she said, and then immediately, "No, I know why. I mean, why are you hesitating?" "Who said I was hesitating? You've been declining his offers for 15 years and now there's a new one, and you're in the city, and you're at the Harrington, which is not actually near the art museum or the shop on the east side." She looked at him. "You came because you were thinking about it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular expression of a man acknowledging a correct read, "Maybe." "The program would be good. It would be very good," he said without false modesty. "That's what makes it hard." "What's hard about something being good?" He picked up his fork again, turned it in his fingers. "Culver's Creek, the shop, the work I do there. It's not glamorous and it's not large, but it's mine. I know those customers. I know what they need. I fix things for people who can't afford to replace them, which matters in a town where people don't have a lot of slack in their budgets." He paused. "A national program means travel, means being somewhere else, means the shop sits." He set the fork down. "I'm 62, Victoria. I'm not 25. I know what it takes to build something from scratch, and I know what it costs." "So you're afraid," she said. He looked at her. "Not of the work," she said quickly. "I know you're not afraid of the work, but of leaving something you built, of the cost." "A little," he said. He said it without apparent difficulty. Her father had always been able to admit to things that most men in his position would have worked to hide. It was one of the things she'd taken for granted about him without understanding how rare it was. "And I'm not sure I'm the right person for something that size." "Why not?" "Because I'm a machinist from Ohio who taught one man something useful 30 years ago. John has built that into a story bigger than what it was." "Has he?" She leaned forward slightly. "The fabrication processes you developed are still in use. You said so yourself. You held patents on methods that an industry used to build things for decades. You raised a kid alone while running a business and somehow produced—" She stopped, looked at herself from the outside for a moment, and almost laughed. "Me. Which is, look, that's a complicated thing to put on your resume, but it's real." "You raised yourself," Ethan said. "You handed me the tools," she said, "and you taught me what they were for. Same thing you did for Hayes. Same thing you're apparently doing for anyone who comes into your shop with a question." She looked at him steadily. "That's not one man teaching one person something useful. That's a method. That's the darkroom engine thing. That's a way of building understanding, not just skill. That's what the program would be." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You sound like John," he said. "John is not wrong." He was quiet. The diner hummed around them. Helen refilled his coffee without being asked, the mark of a waitress who pays attention. "I'd have to be gone from the shop more than I'm comfortable with," he said. "You could hire someone, train them the right way." "Training someone to run my shop the right way takes 2 years minimum." "Then start now." He looked at her. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about it since Frances showed me the background file, and I understood what you actually built." She folded her hands on the table. "Dad, you spent 30 years making yourself small enough to fit into a life that felt safe. And I spent 10 years making myself big enough to fit into a life I thought I wanted. And neither of us got it exactly right." She paused. "Maybe it's time to try something different." The silence between them was a thinking silence. She knew the quality of it. He was not dismissing what she'd said. He was putting it into the same systematic consideration he applied to everything else, taking it apart, examining the pieces, assessing how they fit. "The shop," he said finally. "I'm not closing it. No one said close it. I'm not turning it into something it's not. It stays what it is." He turned the coffee mug. "I'd need to know the program is genuinely what John says it is. Not a vanity project, not a PR move for Hayes Industrial. Something that actually works for the people in it. I can look at the financials, she said. The structure. I know how to tell the difference between a real investment and window dressing. If it's real, you'll know. He looked at her across the table, the two bright diner light, both of them with half-eaten plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes in front of them at 11 o'clock at night, in a vinyl booth 6 blocks from the Harrington, having a conversation that had been waiting, in one form or another, for a very long time. "You do that?" he said. "Look at it." "I'd want to, actually." She meant it. It's an interesting structure problem. National scale, workforce development focus, private funding with public benefit framing. There are models that work for that. I'd want to see what they've built. And if it's not right, then we tell them what would make it right. He almost smiled. We. She hadn't noticed she'd said it. Now she noticed, and didn't take it back. "We," she said. He picked up his fork, ate. The matter seemed neither settled nor unsettled. It was in the state that things go into when two careful people have said enough to move the discussion forward, but both know that the real work comes later and are honest enough not to rush past that. She had learned that particular patience from him, she realized, among other things. "Tell me more about the early years," she said. "Before Heartline. You said you were at another shop first." He looked at her. The wariness she'd seen earlier in the evening, the careful management of what to reveal, was different now. Not gone, but different. Like a door that's been decided about, even if it hasn't been walked through yet. "Burnham Tool and Die," he said. "I was 19. The foreman was a man named Roy Pelletier, who I couldn't stand and who taught me more about precision work than anyone before or since. That's usually how it goes." She settled into the corner of the booth and listened. He talked for an hour and a half. It was not a smooth account. It was the kind of story that gets told by someone who is not a natural storyteller, but who knows the material too well to lose the thread. He doubled back, corrected details, stopped to think, said things like, "No, that's not right. The Burnham job was before the..." and then reorganized. She listened with the focused attention that was her professional signature, and also, she understood now, something she'd inherited, and she asked questions when he paused, and he answered them. She learned things, specific, irreplaceable things that no biographical file could have given her. The texture of his early years, the particular sequence of choices and accidents and relationships that had assembled into the person sitting across from her. The foreman he couldn't stand who taught him everything. The 2 years he'd spent developing the first of the patented processes, working nights in the shop after everyone else had gone home because it was the only time he had the equipment to himself. The moment he'd met her mother, a parking lot, a flat tire, Ethan with a jack because he always had a jack, which she had heard a version of before but never the full version, and the full version was better. More complicated. More like something real. When she asked about the moment in the photograph and the year I figured out what I was for, he was quiet for a long moment. "I'd been at Heartline about a year," he said. "We had a contract that was going wrong. Custom fabrication for an agricultural equipment company. The tolerances on one of the components were off by a margin that shouldn't have mattered in theory, but was causing cascading problems in the assembly." He paused. "I worked on it for 3 days. Ate at the shop. Barely slept. John kept asking if I needed help, and I kept saying no because I could tell it was something I needed to find myself, or I'd never fully understand it. Did you find it?" "On the 3rd day, at about 2 in the morning. He looked down at his coffee. It was a thermal expansion issue. The tolerances were correct for standard temperature, but the operating environment of the equipment was running 15 degrees warmer than spec. It was expanding just enough to matter. He shook his head slightly. "Once I saw it, it was obvious. But you can only see it once you understand the system well enough to follow the problem all the way down." "And that was it? That was the year?" "That was the night," he said. "The year was everything that led up to the night, all the mistakes and the reworking and the starting over. But that night was the moment I understood what I was actually able to do. Not what I'd been trained to do, what I was able to do." He paused. "Some people spend their whole lives and never have that moment. I was 26. I knew I was lucky." She looked at the photograph in her mind. The way he was crouched. The focused expression. The year I figured out what I was for. "You should have that photograph somewhere better than a box," she said. "It It was in my desk for 20 years. I thought you might want it. She looked at him. Did you know I'd find out about Hayes eventually? She said. Is that part of why you brought it? He met her eyes. I thought you might be curious about where you came from after a while. His expression was very careful and very honest. I thought if you ever got curious enough to look, it might help to have something to hold while you did. The thing in her chest that had been cracking open since the night of the party cracked a little further. She looked at the table for a moment. When she looked back up, she did not try to manage her expression, which was something she had been very good at for a very long time and which cost her something to set down. I've been an idiot, she said, for years, about this. You've been scared, he said. It's different. I've been both. Okay, he said. You've been both. He did not argue further because he never argued further once a true thing had been said. They sat for another while. Helen brought the check without being asked. Ethan reached for it. Victoria put her hand over his. He looked at her. I've got it, she said. He looked at her hand on his, the manicured nails, the carefully maintained surface of a life she'd constructed to look a specific way, and then at his own hand underneath, the permanently stained thumbnail, the texture of 30 years. He didn't move his hand away. Okay, he said. She paid. They walked out into the cold November night and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the diner's light warm through the window behind them, the city doing its late-night thing in every direction. You parked? She said. Garage on 5th. He pointed vaguely north. I'll get the truck in the morning before I take it to the shop. He paused. The suspension on the rear left has been bothering me for 3 weeks. Pulling slightly. It's probably the control arm bushing, she said without thinking. He looked at her. She looked at him. They both looked at the fact that she had just diagnosed a suspension problem without seeing the vehicle. From 30 years of osmotic knowledge, she had spent a decade trying to forget she had. Yeah, he said. Probably. She almost laughed. Didn't quite. It sat between them instead, this small, specific proof that the garage had come with her after all, that Culver's Creek had traveled inside her all the way to the 34th floor of the Callaway Tower, that you could spend a decade remaking yourself and still, when someone mentioned a rear suspension pull, know exactly what it was. Get it looked at, she said. That's why I brought it to the city. Before you drive back. Victoria, I know how to maintain a vehicle. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. He looked at her. The almost smile again. Good night, kiddo. Good night, Dad. He walked north toward the parking garage. She watched him go. The particular walk of him, the unhurried stride of a man who has never been in a hurry to arrive anywhere because he trusts himself to get there, until he turned the corner and was gone. She stood on the sidewalk for another minute in the cold. The card Hayes had given her was in her jacket pocket. She could feel the corner of it. She thought about the program, the real shape of it, the structural questions, the funding model, the curriculum design that would need someone who understood what actually needed to be transmitted, and not just the official version of skill transfer. She thought about Ethan in a room full of young people who didn't know yet what they were for, doing in the dark engine thing, making them understand rather than memorize. She thought about what he'd said over the meatloaf. You handed me the tools, and you taught me what they were for. She turned that over. Then she walked home, 12 blocks because she needed the air and the movement and the city around her. And when she got back to Callaway Tower, she nodded at Dennis and rode the elevator to 34 and stood in her kitchen looking at the photograph on the counter, the young man at 26 in the moment of knowing what he was able to do. She picked it up and took it to the living room and set it on the bookshelf where she could see it from the couch. Not face down, not in a drawer, where it belonged. She sat on the couch for a long time thinking. The floor doesn't care about yesterday. What are you building today? She called Hayes on a Monday morning, 3 days after the diner. Not from her office, from the kitchen of her apartment, before the workday started, standing at the counter with her coffee and the photograph on the bookshelf visible through the doorway. She had decided sometime in the small hours of Saturday night that she was not going to treat this like a professional call, because it wasn't one, and performing professional distance on a conversation that was actually personal was exactly the kind of thing she was trying to stop doing. Hayes picked up on the second ring. I want to see the program documents, she said. The real ones. Financial structure, curriculum framework, the pilot design, the metrics you're using to evaluate success. Not the investor deck, the working documents. A brief pause. Good morning to you too, Victoria. Good morning. The documents. She could hear something in the background, shock, voices, a door, the ambient noise of a large office. Hayes moved somewhere quieter. I can have them to you by end of day. Can I ask what changed? I had dinner with my father. Ah. A pause that understood more than it said. I'll send everything. The documents arrived at 4:15, a folder so dense that Priya, who Victoria had asked to help her process them without explaining why, just flagging it as a priority personal project, spent 2 days building a summary framework before Victoria sat down with the full material herself. What she found, over a long weekend at her kitchen table with the files spread across her laptop and printed pages annotated in the margins, was not what she'd expected. She had expected something half-formed, a wealthy man's passion project, the kind of initiative that gets funded generously and designed poorly because the people building it understand capital but not the actual problem. She had seen enough of those to recognize the architecture quickly. Impressive headline numbers, vague outcome measures, a curriculum borrowed from existing models without sufficient adaptation, and a governance structure that would make it difficult to course-correct when things went wrong. What Hayes had built was different. The financial structure was serious, a 10-year funding commitment from Hayes Industrial's foundation arm, with a matching program that created incentives for regional manufacturing employers to co-invest, which meant the program wasn't entirely dependent on Hayes's continued interest or solvency. The curriculum framework was incomplete, which was honest rather than a flaw. They had outlined what it needed to do without pretending they knew exactly how to do it, which told her they understood the gap and were looking for someone who could fill it, rather than someone who would validate what they'd already decided. The pilot was designed for a mid-sized city in the industrial Midwest, 3 cohorts of 20 participants each, with a genuine evaluation structure that included failure metrics. They had written down what would tell them the program wasn't working, which almost nobody does because almost nobody wants to build in the possibility of being wrong. She made notes. A lot of them. She found 3 structural problems she would want to address before the pilot launched, 2 significant risks that weren't adequately hedged in the current design, and 1 element, the mentorship pairing protocol, that was genuinely thoughtful in a way that suggested someone on Hayes's team had done real fieldwork rather than just reading the literature. She also found, in the appendix of the curriculum framework document, a section on the philosophy of skills transmission. It was written plainly, without the polished language of a professional education consultant, and she recognized the thinking in it, the way you recognize a voice you've heard your whole life translated into unfamiliar text. The section made an argument about the difference between procedural knowledge and genuine understanding, about how most vocational training teaches people to follow steps, and how the steps fail when the situation changes, and how the only training that actually transfers to real-world problem-solving is training that makes people understand the principles underneath the steps. At the bottom of the page, in parentheses, someone had written, per EC, working draft, needs expansion. EC. She sat at her kitchen table at 11 on a Sunday night and looked at those 2 letters and felt something move through her that was made of too many things to separate cleanly, pride and sadness, and a particular species of love that only exists between people who have been finding each other across a distance for a long time. He had already started. He had been part of this quietly, in the way he did everything, without announcing it, without making it a declaration. He'd been in conversation with Hayes's team. He'd put his ideas on paper. He was already in the room, just not yet all the way through the door. She called Ethan at 9 the next morning. I read everything, she said. I figured you would. The mentorship pairing protocol is strong. The financial hedge structure is more sophisticated than I expected. The curriculum framework is incomplete in the right places. She looked at her notes. There are 3 things I'd want fixed before the pilot launches. The outcome metrics are measuring completion rather than application. You can complete a training program and still not know how to handle a problem you haven't seen before. The employer co-investment structure needs a minimum quality threshold, or you'll end up with companies using the program for cheap labor rather than genuine development. And the geographic selection criteria for the pilot city need to account for existing industry infrastructure, or the graduates won't have anywhere to go. Silence on the line. Those are good, Ethan said. I know. Do you want to write them up together, or should I put them in a memo to Hayes directly? Another pause. Together, he said. I want to understand the financial reasoning behind the second one. I'll walk you through it. When can you come to the city? I've got a job through Wednesday. Thursday. Thursday works. She wrote the memo over the next 3 evenings, and Ethan drove up Thursday morning and sat at her kitchen table, his jacket over the back of the chair, coffee in the white mug she'd given him without thinking about it, the mug she'd had since graduate school. And they went through it section by section. He pushed back on 2 of her recommendations in ways that improved them. She pushed back on one of his additions because the language was too technically specific for the administrative audience who would need to implement it, and they rewrote it together in something between her register and his. It took 4 hours. At the end, they had a 12-page document that was sharper than either of them would have produced alone, which was satisfying in the specific way that collaborative work is satisfying when both people are actually doing it rather than managing each other. Hayes called the day after they sent it. This is the most useful document anyone has sent me in 3 years of working on this program, he said, without preamble. Who wrote it? We did, Victoria said. That's what I thought. A pause. Ethan said yes, didn't he? He hasn't said yes yet. He wrote 12 pages of detailed structural recommendations for a program he's not planning to be involved in. She looked at Ethan across the kitchen table. He was looking at the photograph on the bookshelf. I'll let him tell you, she said, and handed the phone across. She went to the window and gave them the conversation. She heard fragments. Ethan's voice, careful and specific, asking questions about the pilot timeline, the team structure, what role Hayes was envisioning, how much of his time it would actually require. She heard Hayes answering with what sounded like real directness rather than salesmanship. She heard Ethan say something about the shop that she couldn't make out, and Hayes respond, and a silence that lasted long enough to mean something was being considered rather than deferred. Then, all right, she heard her father say. Let's talk about what a real version of this looks like. She kept looking at the window. The city was doing its midday thing, movement, accumulation, the permanent business of a place that never entirely stops. She had lived here for 8 years, and she was still not entirely of it, which she was only now beginning to understand was not a flaw in her assimilation, but simply a fact about who she was. She had come from somewhere specific. That specificity did not disappear just because she'd built something new on top of it. It was still the foundation. It had always been. The months that followed were not a montage. They were actual months, with the texture that actual time has. Uneven, sometimes tedious, marked by progress that was real but irregular, and setbacks that were real and also irregular, which is how things go when you are building something that matters. Ethan found a young mechanic named Darius to apprentice at the shop in Culver's Creek. He was 23, had the particular quality of someone who is more intelligent than his education has yet accounted for, and he had come in one afternoon to ask about an engine problem on his sister's car, and ended up staying for 2 hours while Ethan walked him through the diagnosis with the methodical patience that was his signature. Ethan called Victoria that evening and said, I think I found the person for the shop. And Victoria said, good, and meant it, and they both understood what it meant without saying it directly. The training, as Ethan had said, would take 2 years minimum to do right. So he started. He drove to the city twice a month to work on the pilot curriculum with Hayes' education team, a small group of 4 people who were a mixed bag of genuinely excellent and frustratingly theoretical, and who improved considerably over the first 6 months as Ethan's presence calibrated what the actual work required. Victoria sat in on 3 of these sessions, not as a participant but as an observer, and what she watched in those rooms was something she had seen her whole life and never had adequate language for. Her father making people understand things, not telling them, making them understand. The distinction was everything, and it was not teachable in the abstract. It was only visible in practice, in the specific patience of someone who will wait as long as it takes for the actual comprehension to arrive, rather than accepting the performance of it. The pilot city was selected in February. a mid-sized industrial city in Indiana called Morrow Falls that had the infrastructure Ethan and Victoria had insisted on: existing manufacturing base, a community college with a technical program they could partner with, an unemployment rate in skilled trades that indicated genuine need rather than manufactured demand. Hayes flew there with Ethan and two of the curriculum team in March, and Victoria drove up separately on a Friday afternoon because she wanted to see it herself, not in a report, but in person. She met them at the community college. Ethan was in the middle of a conversation with the department head, a woman named Carla Reyes who had been running skilled trades programs for 15 years and who had the efficient skepticism of someone who had watched a lot of outside initiatives arrive with fanfare and dissolve within 18 months. Victoria watched Ethan handle her skepticism not by dismantling it, but by engaging it directly, asking questions about what had failed before and why, which was both the right thing to do professionally and also just who he was. At one point, Carla said, "The problem with most of these programs is they're designed by people who've never actually done the work. They know what skill acquisition is supposed to look like from the outside, and it doesn't look like anything close to what it actually is." Ethan said, "What does it actually look like?" She looked at him. Messy, non-linear, full of failure. The trainee fails, tries again, fails differently, and at some point something clicks that you can't schedule or predict. And then they know it. But you can't put that on a grant application. "No," Ethan said, "but you can design around it. If you build enough time and enough reps into the structure, the click happens reliably. You can't schedule the moment. You can create the conditions." Carla was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where did you train?" "Burnham Tool and Die. Then I started my own operation." "How long ago?" 30 years. "You still do it? The hands-on work?" 5 days a week. She looked at him with the specific regard of someone who has just been given information that changes an assessment. "Okay," she said. "Tell me about the conditions." Victoria stood against the wall and listened to her father describe the method he'd been using his entire life to train people. Not as a curriculum, not as a framework, but as a set of principles derived from 3 decades of actual practice, the way all real knowledge gets derived. She had heard the principles in fragments over the years. In the garage, in the stories at Paulette's, in the philosophy section of the program document with his initials at the bottom. But hearing them laid out completely, in sequence, for someone who needed to understand them for practical reasons rather than personal ones, was a different experience. It was the dark room engine thing. It was understanding, not procedure. It was building the conditions for the click. It was giving people the underlying principles so that when they encountered a problem they hadn't seen before, and they would always encounter problems they hadn't seen before, because the world does not present itself in the form of solved examples. They had something to work with. She thought about herself at 22, building the professional self she needed to become. She had learned procedures, the right fork, the right language, the right performance of belonging. What she hadn't built in those years was understanding. She hadn't understood why those procedures mattered, or what they were built on, or what happened when the situation changed and the procedure didn't fit. She'd been running on memorized steps, when the floor turned out to be different from what she'd prepared for, and it always eventually did. She'd improvised badly. She had spent 10 years building an excellent simulation of someone who understood, and then one night her father had shown up on a rooftop and the floor had changed, and she'd found out the difference. You can't schedule the moment. You can create the conditions. The pilot launched in September with 23 participants in the first cohort, 2 short of the projected 25, because 2 enrollees dropped in the first week, which the team had modeled for and which Ethan had said would happen. The cohort was a specific cross-section of the kind of people the program was designed for. 8 men and women in their 20s who had graduated high school without a clear path and ended up in service sector jobs that weren't leading anywhere. 5 adults in career transition, ranging from a former warehouse manager whose facility had automated to a woman in her 40s who had spent 12 years raising children and was re-entering the workforce. 4 veterans with mechanical training from their service who lacked civilian credentials. And 6 people who landed somewhere between those categories in ways that defied clean description, which is how people usually are. Ethan was there for the first 3 weeks of the pilot, staying in a hotel near the community college and driving back to Culver's Creek on weekends to check on Darius and the shop. Victoria drove up the second weekend. Not to observe the program, that was Ethan's domain, not hers, but because he had called on a Thursday evening sounding more tired than she was used to hearing him. Not defeated, but genuinely worn in the way that real effort produces, and she had gotten in her car Friday morning without making a plan. She found him in the college's workshop space at 7:30 in the morning, before the day's session started, checking the equipment set up for an exercise he was running. The space was large and industrial and smelled exactly the way the garage in Culver's Creek had smelled. Motor oil and metal and something else that she didn't have a word for, but that her nervous system recognized immediately, with the specific accuracy of sensory memory. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard her. He was moving through the space with the unhurried competence of someone who is completely at home in a physical environment, checking the height of a workbench, testing the grip on a tool, rearranging something 3 inches to the right for reasons she probably could have explained if she'd thought about it long enough. He was wearing his work clothes, not the versions he wore to Hayes' offices or the curriculum meetings, but the actual ones. Canvas work pants, a thermal undershirt, a flannel over it that was neither the Christmas one she remembered nor one she recognized, so it was new, which meant he was buying flannel shirts, which was exactly what she would have predicted, and which made her, for reasons she couldn't have explained to anyone in her professional life, unreasonably glad. "You didn't say you were coming," he said, without turning around. "I know. Is that okay?" He turned. The lines around his eyes looked deeper under the workshop fluorescence, and there was something in his posture that acknowledged the weeks of effort without complaining about them. "Yeah, it's okay." He looked at her. "You drove?" "Left at 6. "You had coffee?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." He pointed at a small folding table in the corner where someone had set up a coffee station. A drip machine, paper cups, a bag of something from a grocery store rather than anything fancy. "It's not good, but it's hot." She poured herself a cup. It was not good. She drank it anyway. "How's the first cohort?" she said. He leaned against a workbench. "Mixed, which is right." He crossed his arms. "There are 3 who are going to be genuinely excellent. 2 of those know it already, which is fine. 1 doesn't know it yet, which is more interesting." He paused. "There are 4 or 5 who are going to be solid, competent, reliable, the kind of people you want on the floor, and there are a few I'm not sure about yet. Not sure in which direction. And whether they're here because they want this or because they didn't know where else to go." He said it without judgment. Both are legitimate starting points, but they need different things, and it takes a few weeks to see which is which. What do the ones who don't know where else to go need? He thought about it. To find out that they're good at something. That's usually what's missing. Not skill, not aptitude. They often have plenty of that. Just the experience of being good at something. Once they have that, the direction tends to clarify itself. She drank the bad coffee and thought about that. "I was like that," she said. "Not with the trades, but in the early years at Meridian. I was good at the work before I knew I was good at it, before I trusted it." "I know," he said. "I watched it from a distance." She looked at him. "You thought I wasn't paying attention," he said. "It wasn't an accusation, just a fact," said mildly. "I was paying attention, I just didn't know how to be useful from where I was standing." She set down the paper cup. "You could have called more." "So could you." She accepted that. It was true in both directions, which was how most true things were. "I'm going to be here more," she said. Not in a professional capacity, just, "I want to see what you're building." He looked at her for a moment. "You can sit in on sessions if you want. I can't guarantee you won't be asked to help." "I know how to hold a torque wrench." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yeah," he said. "You do." She sat in on 2 sessions that weekend. The first was a diagnostic exercise. Participants were given a non-functioning small engine with no documentation and asked to figure out what was wrong with it. No instructions, no procedure, just the engine and the tools and the question. Ethan moved through the room while they worked, watching, asking questions. never answering the question being asked, but always answering a related one that required the person to think one level deeper than they were currently thinking. She recognized the method. She had experienced it from the other side for most of her childhood. At one point, a young man named Terrence, early 20s, intense in the specific way of someone who has been underestimated and has developed focus as a response, got frustrated and said, "I don't know what I'm looking for." Ethan crouched next to the workbench. "What have you ruled out?" "I haven't." Terrence stopped. "I've been trying to figure out what's wrong." "Start with what's right," Ethan said. "Everything that's right is something you don't have to look at anymore. What's right?" Terrence looked at the engine. He started over. 12 minutes later, he found the problem. He looked up at Ethan with the expression of someone who has just had a click happen. The specific brightness of it, the surprise mixed with something that isn't quite pride but is in that neighborhood. The look of someone who has found out something real about their own capability. Ethan said, "There it is. Not, 'Good job.' Not, 'I knew you could do it.' Just, there it is." The acknowledgement that the thing existed, that he'd found it, that it was real. Victoria stood against the wall with her arms folded and felt the memory of every moment in the garage when he'd said something similarly spare, and she had understood, even as a child, that spare meant real. The second session was different, lecture mostly, Ethan explaining the underlying principles of thermal dynamics as they applied to metal fabrication, in the plain language of someone who has explained it to a practical audience enough times to know exactly where the unnecessary complexity is. She watched the room. She watched who was tracking and who was lost and who was pretending to track. She watched Ethan adjust, slow down in some places, skip over what he'd planned to say because the room's comprehension told him it wasn't needed, circle back when he saw that something hadn't landed. Afterward, when the participants had gone to lunch, she helped him stack the chairs. "Carla Reyes was right," Victoria said. "It is messy. You can't tell from the outside whether it's working." "Not from the outside," he said. "You have to be in it." "How do you know when it's working?" He picked up 2 chairs by their backs. "You watch their hands," he said. "When someone understands something, their hands know it before their mouth does. Watch how they pick up a tool, how they move around the equipment, whether they're hesitating or flowing." He stacked the chairs. "The mouth can pretend to understand. The hands can't." She thought about that for a long time. 2. Victoria's 31st birthday came on a Saturday in November. She didn't organize a party. She had thought about it, Clara had asked, diplomatically, in early October. And Victoria had said not this year, and Clara had accepted this with the look of someone who understood more than was being said. What Victoria did instead was drive to Culver's Creek on Friday evening after work, arriving at Ethan's house at 8:30 with a bag of groceries and no particular plan. The house was the same house she'd grown up in. This was not a remarkable fact. She had grown up in it, she had been back many times over the years, but she noticed it differently now, driving up the familiar street in the dark, the porch light on because he always left it on when he knew she was coming. The smallness of it, which she had once read as limitation, now read as something else, deliberateness, the house of a man who had what he needed and had not spent the difference on performance. She made dinner while Ethan sat at the kitchen table and read something on the tablet Hayes' team had eventually convinced him to use for program communications. She made pasta, not elaborately, just competently, the way she'd learned in this kitchen. And they ate and talked about Darius, who was progressing well, and the second cohort in Morrow Falls, which was enrolling, and a fabrication problem one of the first cohort participants had brought to Ethan that week that had turned into a 2-hour conversation about metallurgy that Ethan described with the particular pleasure of someone who genuinely enjoys being surprised by a question. After dinner, they sat on the porch. November in Ohio was cold enough to require jackets, and they sat in the 2 chairs that had been on that porch for as long as she could remember. And the neighborhood was quiet the way small-town neighborhoods are quiet at 9 on a Friday. A few lights in windows, the occasional car, the sound of something moving in the yard at the edge of the dark. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "The party last year." She looked at the dark yard. "I've been thinking about it differently lately, not just about what I did wrong, and I've been thinking about why, the actual why, not the version I told myself." She paused. "I think I was afraid that if people saw you, they'd see me. The real version, not the person I'd built. And? And I thought that version would lose. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm, the old habit. I thought if they saw where I came from, they'd recalculate everything, what I was worth, whether I belonged. Do you still think that? She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer required more precision than the easy one. I think I still carry it, she said. The fear. I don't think it goes away completely just because you understand where it comes from, but it doesn't make my decisions anymore. Or I'm trying to make sure it doesn't. That's the work, he said. The rest of your life, probably. I know. She looked at him. Does it ever stop? The thing you're working against? He was quiet long enough that she knew it was a real answer forming, not a quick one. The thing changes, he said. When your mother was sick, the thing was grief that I couldn't afford to feel because you needed me functional. For years after, the thing was the distance between us. Watching you build a life that didn't have room for where you came from and not knowing how to close that without pushing you further. He paused. The thing doesn't stop. It just becomes something you know how to carry. She looked at her father in the porch chair in the cold November dark, and she thought about all the years of Sunday phone calls and voicemails and wire transfers and maintained distance, all the years of both of them carrying their separate things without enough conversation between them to share the weight. She thought about what it had taken to get here. Not an event, not a single reconciliation, but a series of ordinary decisions to keep showing up, to keep asking questions, to keep being honest about what was true even when the true thing was uncomfortable. She thought about Terrence in the workshop, starting over with what was right instead of what was wrong, and finding the problem 12 minutes later. I'm sorry it took me so long, she said. You got here, he said. That's not the same thing. No, he said, but it's what matters. He looked at the yard. I'm not interested in the accounting, Victoria. I've never been interested in who owes what to who. I just want... He stopped. Found it. I just want to know you, the actual you, not the CEO, not the version you built for them, the one that knows what a torque wrench is and can diagnose a rear suspension pull from a description over the phone. She made the sound that was not quite a laugh. It kept coming back, that sound. She's here, Victoria said. She's been here the whole time. I know, he said. I could always tell. They sat for a while in the quiet. The porch light made a small yellow circle against the dark, and the November cold was the real kind, not unpleasant if you were dressed for it, which they were. Inside the house, the kitchen light was still on, and the familiar smell of it, the particular domestic smell of a house where someone has been living and cooking for decades, came through the screen door in small increments when the air moved. She thought about Morrow Falls, the workshop. Terrence's hands moving differently once the understanding arrived. She thought about what she wanted the next year to look like. Not the professional year, she had that figured out well enough, but the actual year, the year in which she was a person and not just a function. I want to be involved, she said, with the program, not operationally. That's yours and Hayes's and Carla's, but I want to help build the sustainability model, the long-term funding structure, so it doesn't disappear when the initial enthusiasm fades, which it will. I know it will, Ethan said. I want to make sure the structure survives that. She paused. I'm good at building structures that survive. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. You are. I got that from you, she said, whether you know it or not. The thing you do, understanding the principles underneath the procedure, so when the situation changes, you have something to work with. I do that. I've been doing it since you taught me in the garage. I just didn't know that's what you'd taught me. He was quiet. You built me, she said, same way you built Hayes, same way you're building the people in Morrow Falls. You don't take credit for it, which is your right, but I want you to know that I know. The yard was very quiet. Somewhere down the street, a dog said something brief and then went silent. When Ethan spoke, his voice had the quality it had on the night he'd said, "You've got to let me say it was hard. Careful, carrying something, working to get it right. Your mother would have..." He stopped. She would have liked who you're becoming. She always said you'd take the long way to everything and arrive exactly right. Victoria looked at him. She was right, he said, simply. The way he said things that were true. She did not have adequate language for what she felt. She had always been better with the language of analysis than the language of feeling, and in this moment, analysis was not the right instrument. So she sat in the imprecision of it, which was uncomfortable and also, she was learning, necessary. The same way the darkness in the workshop was necessary, because it removed the shortcuts and made you actually feel for the shape of what was there. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. He put his other hand over hers. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The following June, Morrow Falls held a small completion ceremony for the first cohort of the program. 21 of the original 23, which was a completion rate that Carla Reyes said was the highest she'd seen in 15 years of running similar programs, and which she said with the satisfied expression of someone who has been converted to something she'd been professionally skeptical of and is willing to admit it. Victoria drove up for it. So did Hayes. They sat in the back of the community college's event space, a gymnasium that had been reorganized with folding chairs and a podium at the front, and watched 21 people in their various configurations of nervousness and pride walk across a small stage and shake Ethan's hand and receive a certificate that Carla had designed to look like a professional credential rather than a participation trophy, which was her contribution to the philosophy of the thing. Ethan spoke briefly before the ceremony. He was not a public speaker in any practiced sense. He had the discomfort with performance that belongs to people who prefer to communicate through work. But he had something that made performances unnecessary, the quality of meaning exactly what he said, without embellishment, which an audience always recognizes and responds to, even when they can't name what they're responding to. He said, "Every person in this room learned something this year that cannot be untaught. Not a skill. Skills can be forgotten, updated, made obsolete. You learned how to think about a problem, how to find the principle underneath the procedure, how to start with what's right and work toward what's wrong, how to keep going when you're in the dark." He paused. "The jobs you get from here, whatever they are, will present you with situations you haven't seen before. That's not a warning, that's the work. And you are now the kind of people who can do that work." The room was very quiet. "That's it," he said. "Go shake some hands." Victoria watched Terrence cross the stage. His hands, when he shook Ethan's, were steady. He said something she couldn't hear, and Ethan nodded, and whatever passed between them in that moment had the quality of something real. Not ceremony, but actual recognition, the specific acknowledgement of one person who builds things to another who is beginning to understand that he can. Hayes leaned over to Victoria during the reception after and said quietly, "Second cohort is enrolled, third city wants to talk. I've had 3 regional manufacturing associations reach out in the last month about partnership." "I know," she said. "I've been talking to 2 of them. The sustainability structure is holding. You built a good model. My father taught me how to build models that work under conditions you haven't anticipated." She looked at Ethan across the room, where he was in conversation with Carla and 2 of the participants and someone she didn't recognize who had the look of a local employer who had come to see what the program produced. "I just applied the method." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "He's going to be good at this," he said. "The teaching, the scaling. He's going to be genuinely good at it. He's been good at it for 30 years, she said. "We just didn't have a structure large enough to see it." She drove home that evening as the light was going long and golden over the Indiana fields. The particular light of early summer in the Midwest, the light she had grown up under and then left behind, and which still, after all the years in the city, hit her differently than city light did. Something in it that was unmediated, that came at you without the filter of glass and steel and height. She drove with the windows down because it was warm enough for that, and the air smelled like cut grass and distance, and she thought about the year since her 30th birthday. She thought about the rooftop, the gift with the silver and gold star paper sitting on a side table, the photograph, the lobby chair, the diner, and the meatloaf, and the conversation she should have been having for a decade. The workshop in Morrow Falls, Terrence finding the problem by starting with what was right, the porch in Culver's Creek, November cold, her hand on her father's arm. She thought about what she was building, the actual inventory of it, not the professional version, not the Meridian version, but the real one. She was building a relationship with her father that was belated and imperfect and honest. She was building a financial structure for a program that would train people for decades if they got it right. And they were getting it mostly right. She was building a version of herself that she was less ashamed of, not because the earlier version had been worthless, but because it had been incomplete, and incomplete things can't stand the full weight of a life. She was building in the dark, which meant she couldn't always see the shape of what she was making. She had to feel for it. She had to trust the principles. The road ran straight through the flat land, lit by the low sun ahead of her, and she drove toward it with both windows down and the radio off. And the world was very large and very ordinary, and she was exactly in the middle of it, which was, she had finally come to understand, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not at the top of a rooftop. Not performing for a room full of people whose opinions she'd mistaken for something permanent. Just here. Just this. A woman on a highway in June, driving home from watching her father do what he'd always done. Make someone understand something real. And understanding, finally, what he'd been building all along. It was her. It had always been her.